Hi there, I'm Davey Cretin for Cretin Classics. This is another in my Rant series. Recently, I've heard a couple of people on YouTube in the progressive rock community disparage Genesis stuff from the 80s and beyond. And I have a bit of a problem with that because I came into Genesis in 1980 with the Duke album, and I have that right here, the Duke album, Duke by Genesis. At any rate, so that's when I came into the band. I heard the songs Misunderstanding, Turn It On Again, and Behind the Lines on the radio. Fell in love with those songs and eventually the band. I didn't even know about the earlier stuff. I hadn't heard it on the radio. The songs were so long they weren't played. They were prog rock band, more so in the 70s. In the 80s, I would say they were the most successful in changing their sound a bit and streamlining to fit in with the sound of the day. The 80s was a totally different decade musically than the 70s. And Genesis managed to make the move from the 70s to the 80s better than any other prog band. Some would say yes, but I would say Genesis were the most successful at it. So I discovered the band in 1980. And years later, when I was working at a record store in the late 80s, two of my coworkers said, "Hey, what kind of music do you like?" I said, "My favorite band is Yes." They said, "Well, do you love the Peter Gabriel era Genesis?" And I said, "I've never even heard that stuff." They said, "Oh, wait till you hear this stuff." And they were right. 70s stuff is amazing. It's phenomenal. It's prog rock to the nth degree. And I love it. And that's probably my favorite period of Genesis, the Gabriel years, and a little after that when they were a quartet. But getting to the 80s, they still had progressive tendencies. They had long songs. And I'm here to prove it to you that Genesis remained a progressive band. You could say the meaning of progressive, prog rock, progressive, to progress, to move on. So they changed with the times, they changed their sound, they still fit in, they sold millions of records. They were a stadium act worldwide. That's how many albums they sold. Everyone knew Genesis. I mean, everyone in the 80s thought it was synonymous with Phil Collins because he had a great parallel solo career and his career with Genesis. So he was everywhere in the 80s. And anyone who saw Live Aid knows that he played both sides of the Atlantic. So by the end of the decade, there was burnout on Phil Collins. But let me get to my first point, the length of the songs. Most people know that progressive rock, long songs. Every album by Genesis has at least one song that's 7 minutes or longer, except the first album from 1969. From Genesis to Revelation, because that's more of a pop, maybe psych pop album, you can call it. Every song is under 5 minutes. But by the time 19 months later that Trespass came out in the fall of 1970, Trespass had 3 songs over the 7 minute mark. In 1971, Nursery Crime, 3 songs over the 7 minute mark. 72, I wrote down the wrong thing, it's Foxtrot, has 3 songs over the 7 minute mark. 1973, Selling England by the Pound, 4 songs over the 7 minute mark. And these guys were making very long albums for the early 70s. Most bands, 35-minute albums. Genesis were putting out 45, 50, close to 55-minute records for basically the whole decade of the 70s. So they were really giving fans a bang for their buck. Moving on to the double album, 1974, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. 2 songs over the 7 minute mark and one a few seconds away from that. Without Peter Gabriel when he left the band, The Trick of the Tail, their first album of 2 in 1976. 2 songs over the 7 minute mark. So here I'm going to tell you the songs and the song lengths. Madman Moon, 7.5 minutes. Ripples, a tad over 8 minutes. Their second album from 1976, Wind and Wuthering, which I have right here. Great album. This is the CD DVD version of it that Atlantic put out a while back. Great collection. Wind and Wuthering, 2 songs over the 7 minute mark. 11th Earl of Mar at nearly 8 minutes, and One for the Vine, 10-minute song. And then there were 3, their first album as a trio. This is when they sort of started the whole shorter songs idea. But there is still a song over 7 minutes, Burning Rope, 7 minutes, 10 seconds. Moving on to 1980, the Duke album, one song over 7 minutes, 841, Duke's Travels, which originally was a whole 25, 30-minute suite, and then they broke it up into 5 or 6 songs and scattered them throughout the album. Duke, excellent album. And if you're not familiar with Genesis, a very good starting point. Next came Abacab in 1981. And Abacab has 2 songs over the 7 minute mark, if you include the title track, which is 2 seconds under 7 minutes, and the Dodo Lurker Suite is 7.5 minutes. In 1983, they released the self-titled album, the Shapes album, whatever you want to call it. There's a song, 2 songs, if you put them together, it makes a suite, Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea, over 11 minutes long. Invisible Touch in 1986, their huge breakthrough pop album, still has a long song on it. In fact, it has 2 long songs on it. You have Tonight, Tonight, Tonight at almost 9 minutes, and the Domino Suite, almost 11 minutes. Moving on to We Can't Dance from 1991. 3 songs over 7 minutes long. Driving the Last Spike over 10 minutes. Dreaming While You Sleep, 7:20. And Fading Lights over 10 minutes long. Fading Lights to me is the best song in this album. Tony Banks' keyboard work, the end of that song, great. Love that elongated solo he does. Moving on to the one and only album without Phil Collins on lead vocals. Features Ray from Stiltskin on lead vocals. Calling All Stations, 1997. Banks and Rutherford tried to get back to their prog roots. 4 songs over the 7-minute mark. Alien Afternoon, just about 8 minutes. The Dividing Line, 7:45. There Must Be Some Other Way, just about 8 minutes. And One Man's Fool, almost 9 minutes. So throughout their career, Genesis had long songs. I also recommend this, the Platinum Collection, which is a great 3 CD collection. It starts out with a song, if memory serves, from this album, the last album, Calling All Stations. No, it doesn't. It starts out with No Son of Mine, close. But it starts out in the 90s and then goes all the way back. The last CD is the Gabriel era. So this is a great collection. The Platinum Collection is a great career retrospective. Full-length versions of all the songs. I recommend it. Getting to my next point. People blame Phil Collins. I worked in a record store. My boss hated Phil Collins. Said he's the guy who destroyed progressive rock. No, that's a myth. That's a fallacy. Phil Collins did not destroy progressive rock. Sure, he had a parallel pop career and his career in Genesis at the same time for the whole decade of the 80s. But remember, he was 1/3 of Genesis. It was really Tony Banks' band, and he ruled the band. It was a democracy, but he ruled it, let's say, instead of an iron fist, he had a velvet glove. And basically, he got his way a lot of the time. So people who blame Phil Collins for destroying progressive rock in Genesis, no. There were 3 guys in the band, Banks, Rutherford, and Collins. And remember, Mike Rutherford had his band Mike and the Mechanics. Can't get any more pop rock than Mike and the Mechanics. All I Need Is a Miracle, that's not prog, that's pop rock. Taken In, that's a pop song. Maybe you could say Silent Running, the first hit from the album, has a little bit of prog, spacey, interesting keyboards, very cool song, but you could blame all 3 if you don't like 80s Genesis. But they always had progressive rock elements and tendencies besides the song lengths, because you had Tony Banks in the band. Tony Banks added odd time signatures, unique keyboard sounds, definitely he changed with the times, and just the song structures. He added the prog. Tony Banks is synonymous with prog. He's an underrated keyboard player in my book. Definitely my top 5 keyboard players, but that episode will be coming down the line. And he just added stuff to a simple song like That's All. Let's take the song That's All. It's a pop rock song, But it has interesting keyboards. It has a nice solo that fit in with the times, very unique keyboard sounds on the solo, and just the structure of the song. Might not be prog with a capital P, but he always had interesting hooks that he added to the songs. They all did, all three of the members in the 80s. So I just want to give props for the boys in the band for adding unique stuff to simple songs. Even Turn It On Again, a song that everyone thinks it doesn't have a chorus, but it's catchy. It has that odd, I think it's 11/7 time signature. And that's prog, just throwing in an odd time signature to a catchy song. So Genesis always retained a progressive edge. Think of the song Mad, Mad Moon from A Trick of the Tail. In the midsection of that song, Tony Banks wrote the song, and he layers his keyboards the way that Brian May and Jimmy Page used to layer their guitars on Queen and Led Zeppelin albums, respectively. The way that Tony Banks layers his keyboards, I'm trying to count and figure out how many keyboards is he playing. And then I just get lost and caught up in the haunting melodies and the moods that Tony Banks creates on Mad, Mad Moon. Just because you don't gravitate to the 80s Genesis personally, it doesn't negate all the progressive nature of the music, all the elements that are there. Not every song is prog, but they still have progressive rock tendencies. And you could say Genesis have more progressive rock songs in the 80s than Yes do. Some might argue one way, some might argue the other way, whatever. But just because you're not a fan of it doesn't mean it's not prog. They still have good music. They didn't sell out because any artist who signs to a label, releases music, and makes a record, they want to sell. They want to get their music out there. That's the whole thing about music. Everyone shares in it and enjoys it. So just because you're not a fan doesn't mean it's not prog. And it's a little snobby to look down and say, oh, that's not progressive rock. It is. They change, they move with the times. It's prog adjacent, whatever the heck you want to call it. It's really good music. These are talented players, singers. Well, Phil Collins is the singer, and songwriters for all three of them. Throw Hackett in there too, another great songwriter. Now pardon me, I mean the real secret weapon in this band, just Tony Banks and everything he added to the band from the beginning to the end of the band. It's a shame they didn't continue, but there are still 15 excellent albums out there. I think it's 15 if I counted right, for everyone to enjoy. So that's basically all the reasons that I think that 80s Genesis is underappreciated by the progressive rock crowd. Listen, you'll hear cool stuff. They're a great headphone band, just like Yes. So I came into Genesis in the 80s. Of course, I love the 70s stuff. It's amazing prog rock, but they still have progressive elements and songs in their canon in the 80s and beyond. So basically, I will close with this statement. All the haters are going to drink their haterade, and I'm just going to drink my Gatorade. It's G0, no sugar, but it's still Gatorade. It's got the big G on it. So you can drink your haterade, and I'll drink my Gatorade. This is Davey Cretin for Cretin Classics. I want to remind you to like, subscribe, and comment below about what you think of 80s Genesis. Even if you don't like it, I'll still respect your opinion, but I just want to say that it's really good stuff in the 80s. So rock out, prog on, and pogo. Thanks a lot, and I'll see everyone soon. Take care. Bye-bye.